capitalism. And she argues that Donald Trump's unethical refusal of assistance to Puerto Rico was propelled by persisting mystifications of oceanic spaces as pure nature and of isolated geography, such as islands, as removed from continental land and therefore uncultured. Next, please. Delory confronts these tropes, which the US government implicitly and explicitly calls on to legitimize the denial of sufficient aid to its unincorporated territory. However, ironically, the ongoing transoceanic militarism and colonial intentionality have rarely been hindered by such watery distances. And here's a quote from Delory's text. When questioned as to why he had not sent the hospital ship USNS Comfort to proffer aid and had not lifted the Jones Act to allow more American ships into Puerto Rican harbors, he, Donald Trump, defensively blamed the ocean. And here's a quote by Trump. This is an island surrounded by water, big water, ocean water. We're closely coordinated with the territorial and local governments, which are totally and unfortunately unable to handle this catastrophic crisis on their own. Just totally unable to. End of quote by Trump. And continuation of the quote by Elizabeth Delory. Trump creatively imagines a new geographic space, a Caribbean Ocean, in his recent press conference, describing Puerto Rico as out in the ocean. You can't just drive your trucks there from other states. He seems to have forgotten that the US Navy had a base in Puerto Rico until 2003. And the Navy also occupied and bombed the Puerto Rican island of Vieques from 1941 until protesters drove them out in 2003. That testing range is now a Superfund site contaminated with napalm, depleted uranium, mercury, and other poisonous materials. End of quote. Next slide, please. So the imperial myth of island isolation and other distances that are often supposedly also cultural seek to erase the colonial intentionality of the past and the present. They render tropical islands and other so-called distant spaces as ahistorical and isolated. But what if we could challenge and even reverse this idea of distance and isolation? The Tongan Fijian writer and anthropologist Epeli Hau'ofa's text, Our Sea of Islands, which was first published in 1993, offers a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in the totality of their relationships. Next slide, please. Hau'ofa fiercely criticizes derogatory and belittling views of indigenous cultures, outlining the lasting negative effects these exert on people and their connections to their histories and traditions. And his voice plays a pivotal role in reversing the notion of Oceanian small island developing states, tiny crumbs of land isolated from one another in a vast aquatic expanse, to that of large ocean nations. Hau'ofa overthrows the idea of the ocean as that which divides, redefining it as that which connects. Next slide, please. The shift of perspective prompts new possible outlooks on culture, economy, and political autonomy beyond narrow deterministic views. He reminds us of the epic myths, the oral traditions, and cosmologies of Oceania, a prodigious world that has unjustly been rendered as tiny and deficient in resources as a condition of colonial confinement. Next slide, please. Hau'ofa asks, is it not what neocolonialism is all about, to make people believe that they have no choice but to depend? And he answers, it should be clear now that the world of Oceania is neither tiny nor deficient in resources. It was so only as a condition of colonial confinement and lasted less than 100 of a history of thousands of years. Next, please, and that's a video again, so if you could click on it. Hau'ofa's reversal from islands in a far sea to a sea of islands has fostered a strong movement of self-determination in Oceania, which is still ongoing currently. Navigation methods are being rediscovered, and crafts which are intimately connected with spiritual worlds are retaught. Not only that, activists are becoming very outspoken and mobilize against deep-sea mining, solidarizing across the region. So in Saidpur, in the north of Bangladesh, 2 days ago, we could see mind-bending examples of how not to work against the flood, but with it. And some of them Kashef has just spoken about. So to reverse that usual view and approach, to be innovative with the materials and technologies available, not to surrender to asymmetrical power, but of course, well, things are more complex, and of course, certain fascination is also enticing, but next slide, please. But both the examples from the Pacific and the architectural approaches here represent alternatives. They show that we can find constructive possibilities, reshape conceptions, and tackle difficult realities rather than accepting them as fatal. So we need more of those seas of islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for the last statement, before we open up for discussion, is writer, researcher, and artist Nabil Ahmed, whose work you can see on the third floor. He's going to talk about the INTERPRT, Inter-Pacific Ring Tribunal, and I think specifically about the Marshall Island case, right?
Thanks, Markus. Thanks, Steffi, and everyone else on the panel. I'd like to sort of begin by posing some alternative ways about thinking some of the topics that have already been put on the table. What if we were to sort of think about climate change, rising sea levels, etc., not as just as sort of things that have just happened over time without much agency and so on, but actually as intentional or agentic responsibility, right? Which is primarily shared by the carbon majors, for instance. In that sense, Bangladesh and an island nation like the Marshall Islands, of course, have plenty in common, in the sense that as being both low-lying states and not being totally on the other spectrum of being the carbon majors, the Bangladesh and Marshall Islands have contributed very little to the greenhouse emissions in that scale. Here, it's important to remember, as Huraera sort of pointed out, about the 2 degrees, in that sense that it's behind that number is also a scale, right? In the sense that that number, although that might sound very little, 2 degrees, it's actually about a scalar effect of the greenhouse gases and the rising sea levels and so on, right? I.e., in order to sort of think about the planet as a system, in that sense. However, as we've heard across the panels, right, their impacts are hardly equitable. So what if we were to then to sort of frame climate change also as a crime, right? And the crime being the crime of ecocide. And this is sort of the first sort of premise I'd like to sort of put forward. And the second is that what if then spatial practice, architecture as a kind of spatial practice is no longer mobilized only towards protection, right, and so on, but actually about gathering evidence of that criminal responsibility and of and at different ways a kind of access to justice, right? So where the responsibility, right, as the international community has done with various degrees of success in terms of the serious crimes, right, recognized under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, namely genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. The next slide, please. So I want to briefly, in this context, speak about a project that I set up and which the work from our office is represented in the exhibition from Cosmin, Costinas, a beast, a god, and a lion. So I want to talk about a little bit about some of the research that we presented in the exhibition that you can I invite you to go to, And the project INTERPRT is focused specifically on gathering and presenting evidence on ecocide in the Pacific. And it's a collaboration with the foundation from the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón and the ecocide lawyer Polly Higgins, and who has been leading the campaign of introducing ecocide as the 5th crime against peace in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But in order to sort of reorganize the Pacific in spatial terms, we had to sort of diagrammatize it, right? We had to sort of reorganize it as a space of ecocide. As Steffi has mentioned, because of its distance and the fact, or the fact that was sort of presented at the time during the colonial period as a terra nullius, it was precisely places like French Polynesia that the colonial powers like France could justify blowing up or testing nuclear weapons in peacetime, right? It is also no coincidence that before French Polynesia, the place where the French conducted nuclear tests was in the Algerian deserts. And they had to pack up their project as the Algerian War of National Independence went forward. So they chose a new site, which was in those distant atolls in French Polynesia. So what we see here is a section of a diagram where we try to show the militarization, the nuclear testing, the mineral extraction conflicts that are ongoing in the Pacific along the geology of the Pacific Ring that sort of snakes around its continental shelves. And this is so. I will just briefly, as a way to prompt for our panel, talk about sort of a study that we're doing in the Marshall Islands, and a particular sort of drawing that we made specifically for the Dhaka Art Summit, that I believe sort of captures some of these conflicts around climate change and the frontiers, right, that we have been speaking about, perhaps at a different scale. So this is the Marshall Islands, and the numbers that you see in the circle are the nuclear tests that the Americans conducted in the Marshall Islands. Bikini, of course, is the one that everybody knows for other reasons. How it was sort of popularized in sort of culture. And I would sort of like to point out or take us through, right, in the next slide, please, is a particular sort of monument, right, that is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in Enewetak Atoll, which is in the northern Marshall Islands. So in the geography of Marshall Islands as an archipelago sort of nation, in the southern part of the Marshall Islands, where the capital is Majuro, there's much more, there's a heavier sort of population, right? And in the northern parts of the Marshall Islands, it was pretty much sort of Bikini, Enewetak, Rongelap, and these places where the Americans conducted nuclear tests during the Cold War period, right? With this notion that the Marshallese were going to help the world by actually sort of quote unquote volunteering their land and their seas for a set of nuclear tests. The legacies of which remain, given some of this stuff is highly toxic and has sort of, you know, radiation that goes to the deep time of thousands of years, yet has very immediate impacts at very local levels, some of which Steffi has talked about in the case of the French Polynesia. But this site is sort of like an architectural sort of monument, if you'd like. It's called a runit dome. and it is a site where in the 60s the United States government used as a dumping site for the waste from across the atolls, right? They literally scooped up this stuff and they dumped it in what is a crater that was created from a specific test called the cactus crater. And so what you see on the northern side is the ocean side, and on the southern side is the lagoon side. So it sits on a very very thin layer of land, particularly coral formations and so on, right? The next slide, please. So as part of the, so just again, just to sort of frame this, we're looking specifically at this site. There are 1,000 other things to investigate in this long-standing conflict, and the Marshallese have been one of the leading voices, as you might know, also in climate change negotiations. But also in terms of seeking justice in the nuclear, in their nuclear testing legacy. The Marshallese were the first sort of state that was able to take, using U.S. jurisdiction, that also took the U.S. government to court for decades in seeking reparations for the nuclear tests and its impact on its land and its people. And recently, not very long ago, they were again at the frontier of a small state seeking justice in the world stage, if you'd like, where it single-handedly was able to take all the countries in the world that have nuclear powers, weapons, to the International Court of Justice for a compliance case, right? Which was to try to hold them accountable for the fact that regardless of the nuclear disarmament treaty, none of these countries have let go of their weapons, and they have no intention to do so. We have the same in the UK, in the case of the so-called Trident missile defense system that is supposed to be always at sea, etc. And well, we're well aware of the recent scare in Hawaii, and where the guy pressed the button, and for 45 minutes everybody thought the nuclear bomb had gone off, and in Guam. Which the North Korea put in its sight as in its crosshairs as the place to target, etc. So there are all these geopolitical sort of things to keep in mind. However, what is the forum, and how can we sort of mobilize sort of spatial evidence in this case? So in this study, what we attempted to do was to take the dome and sort of do what we would call an axonometric sort of a study of the dome, through which its thesis is that the dome is the very place which was the site of nuclear tests and which became a site of nuclear waste, is now again a site which is under a threat of going under the water from the rising sea levels, and it is recognized by local people in the Marshallese as really a symbol of the violence and the justice that has not been that they're still seeking, right? On the human side, there's also a parallel, right? Which is this, that in fact it is the according to the Marshallese, they had to be relocated and moved forcibly from their atolls during the period of nuclear tests against their will, and moved to other atolls, and they can never go back to some of their ancestral homes. and they've lost access to their land and sea rights in specific places because of the contamination and the militarization that has taken place there. Again, some of those same places where they have been moved to are places that are under the threat of rising sea levels, and they might have to move again, right? And so it becomes a question also of a kind of responsibility, right, in terms of environmental migration, etc. Of course, in Bangladesh, it's the scale and the magnitude is something else entirely. But if you think about this simple idea, right, that in political theory, the basis of a state is its territory, right? By definition, if the territory is not there, what happens to the state, right? So what we did here was we sort of in the study we looked at how this crater was constructed over time, and where some of the nuclear debris were placed. In the innocuous looking red sort of circle, the remains of a botched test which contained hundreds of sort of huge amounts of undetonated plutonium were simply put in plastic bags and sort of placed in the middle of this in this crater, right? Which is totally crazy if you think about it. Even at that time, this is actually the very moment that the Environmental Protection Agency comes to being in the United States, an agency that the Trump administration is just trying to dismantle, given that its head is a climate change denier, would have never agreed to this kind of disposal method, right? In this way at all, right? So we actually can see, I don't know if you can, but the second image, or some of this bit is cut off from the bottom, but never mind. There's actually images of the plastic bags where this stuff was literally dumped. We also were interrogating a report that was produced by the Department of Agency from the U.S. government that looked at the structural integrity of the dome. Although the government no longer has a legal responsibility to sort of protect these places at all anymore, according to a very one-sided legal agreement that was drafted between the Marshallese government and the United States after it became a sovereign country, when the United States sort of evacuated from its role as the so-called protector of this in Micronesia. But we can see, for instance, in the detail next to so number 3, if you can see that, a sort of a patchwork from a sort of plan view, right, where we can see that a number of these concrete sort of rectangular shapes that sort of that make up the structure of the dome are in various levels of disrepair, right? There have been at least two sort of U.S. government sort of field visits to this site, and with recommendations of repair and so on being tabled and minuted, but nothing has happened since in all these years. But what's But then what's really interesting is that this very idea of this concrete, this perfect-looking concrete shape that even gives this notion that there's a safety or there is a structure and so on is totally put to question, right? When you consider what's underneath, which is that it's actually a porous surface, porous ground. Because no attempt was made to line the bottom of the crater, right? So there's a continuous flow between the lagoon water, the ocean water, and the and what's and constantly washing out the radioactive stuff that's underneath. So the U.S. government's claim, one such claim, is that. The radiation outside of the sea is is probably worse than what's in there. To which we could pose the question, as Tony de Broom, who I had interviewed on a field trip to the Marshall Islands, who had Tony de Broom, the deceased foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, who is one of the sort of greatest environment defenders and political leaders emerging in the 20th century from the Pacific, posed a very simple question: well, why build the dome in the first place? It then becomes where architecture, as it has been used in the past as well, as a kind of propaganda, right? As a kind of public relations exercise. And then it is in a way, it could be that the task then for architecture again is to point out its deficiencies and to sort of look at, to sort of unpack this idea that this is a sound structure, or that this is in fact something that is legitimate and long-standing, if you'd like, right? So what we sort of modeled in the very top, in the final stage of this axonometric sort of study, is to sort of project three different predictions of the IPCC's rising sea levels sort of standards, right? Huraera mentioned one of these as 2 degrees, right? And the fact that, in a way, an irony remaining that given that Marshall Islands is a very low-lying island state, just meters from sea level, in fact, this dome might be one of the things that sort of remains above water. I do not mean this with any irony at all. Please, to the next slide. Because we are interested in working with Polly Higgins, or we are working with Polly Higgins and Judge Baltaja Garçon to work towards something that could be a much longer goal, right? That is not perhaps reachable in the next year or two, or any such short-term sort of time span. But that is to push towards ecocide to be recognized into the Rome Statute, recognizing that there's a gap between how law is practiced and what law sort of is, but nevertheless that this might sort of offer a tool, right, for frontier sort of nations, and using the forum of the International Criminal Court in order to hold state violence and corporate violence accountable for climate change and other environmental crimes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all for contributions. I think what becomes evident here is already in the contributions is that the issues are very specific and very for the certain locations, and that they're immensely complex, and we all struggle to find a language that can actually wrap it up and be this umbrella. So this is the big gap between, well, you said the local specifications and then something very abstract like 2%, right, or 2 degrees. It's like also the language of climate change or sea level rise. It for someone that is not affected by these phenomena, it is extremely hard to imagine and therefore act upon. Right, and then we have the issue where history and historic crimes now collide with a new phenomena, or a relatively new phenomena, which is sea level rise. The question remains for me is, and also the question of this panel is, how can cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and artistic research spatial practices create a new imaginary to actually react upon this and act upon this. And I think it also becomes evident from these 4 very different contributions that a holistic approach or a holistic exploration of these topics, and then creating like, let's say, a creative also answer to them, right? It seems to be at least an attempt to locally react to these newly arising issues and circumstances, like you're doing. nevertheless, I believe that language is an issue. How do we describe these phenomena? How do we describe these situations? And how does this, from a very local level, transport and translate into policy-making spaces like the United Nations in New York, right? For you, where you yeah, you knew it, you saw it, where you really go into even the microcosm of family, right? How do you see the possibility of translating this into a policy-making, or do you see that there is a chance of translating this into a policy-making context that takes into consideration even the smallest units between man and woman in a relationship?
I think one of the recent discussion is we can think about the climate change from a very gender perspective. When we talk about gender, we don't really talk about one group being in the forefront. There's a sort of common notion that when climate change discussion talks about Bangladesh, they put either the women as the victim of different extreme events, or sometimes they like to put the women as the heroines, that since they are planting trees inside a pot which can float during the flood, so they are the champions of the climate change. But what the gender perspective can bring into the discussion, especially at the policy level, is the relationship that change because of this impact, or the exposure to this risk, different kind of hazards, and how people interpret those hazards to be risk to them is dependent on the individual's relationship with other individuals. So that's why there's a big push at the policy level to think the climate change impacts or the climate vulnerability through the gender lens, because we say that if you start looking through the gender lens, you actually start looking into the root causes, not just the exposure to it, but the ability that if there is an exposure, like we are accepting that there will be a 2-degree increase in the overall temperature. So let's accept that there is a reality like that. But how you deal with that will depend on the individual's perception about that risk and how they act upon that risk. So that's where the policy level will actually can benefit from taking a gender lens, that you don't look at the individual as an individual, rather place the individual as an individual who is connected to different individual, which transform into a neighborhood, then transform into a region, then transform into a country. And how do you see that being reflected in the policy that you take action? When we talk a lot about adaptation. And what we see in Bangladesh mostly is about coping. We are just trying to reduce the risk. But if we are to think about adaptation, which is actually a transformation of the society's values or how the society actually works, then we are looking into something which needs not only force from the bottom, but something, a positive environment from the policy level where this transformation, the transformation can happen in terms of how the society works or accept. So I see the gender lens to be sort of a very effective way of looking at the policy level in terms of adaptation, not just coping. Thinking about adaptation that yes, we won't be up to here and we'll say that yes, we are surviving. We need to find a way where we can think about the justice that these people, when you lose your identity because you are addressless, think about yourself. No matter how we blame the nature, saying that yes, it's a natural thing, but at the end of the day, you are losing your identity. So when you are losing your identity, it's about justice. And environmental justice is not about something which just we say that yes, these people are affected and let go and we will compensate them in some way. But think about the people who are actually losing their identity. And not only losing identity, losing the relationship they built over the years within their house, within the neighborhood, and how they will be impacted. Once you start looking from that perspective, I believe that can be more just than thinking about climate change is something just 2 degrees. It's beyond that.
Thank you. I think what transpires here in this conversation are different temporalities of action, right? It's also, and then an imaginary of how to react to the circumstances that we find today, right? From the very real gender lens that you're talking about, and this transpiring into policy level. I think what you're attempting, right, is by zooming out and taking also a historic timeline into account, and reacting to this with an imaginary of the tribunal, of a different form of legal system, also of a different question of what is evidence, and what kind of voices could flow into a legal system. You're projecting far more into the future, right? You're also using remote sensing technologies to look at the different circumstances. But I think really the very real act that you're proposing right now is to deposit a different legal system within a legal system. No?
Yeah, I guess just to sort of a couple of points here. One is I think it's important what you said about the language, right? In the sense that you know, we have to call the crime a crime. You know, justice really begins by calling the crime by its true name, and in this case, it's this is ecocide, and it's not necessarily a word that perhaps is, you know, to sort of the word that immediately comes to mind with people is genocide, right? And you know, the world came to terms with that term through the Nuremberg trials, and we are. This is an accumulated sort of historical moment, right? But we've come to the point where ecocide is the crime, you know, of the 21st century, and how can we sort of mobilize towards this? Now, it's important. I think it's really interesting to sort of think this through. No, I suppose, and often in all our practices, we're sort of working, you know, as a non-state actor, right? You know, like what would be the state's role in producing, like it's one of the basic things about state does is to sort of protect its people, right? And to also think about the state, the people versus population, you know, i.e. the people sometimes is thought as numbers in terms of that being as the second definition of what constitutes in political theory a state is its population, right? You need the territory and the population. So, you know, we have a case where architects are going and doing what the state is supposed to do, right? Is protecting, you know, giving housing to people. We have this in London at the moment with this massive housing crisis, right? Where, you know, we can't afford. There's no affordable housing, you know, because the Tory government doesn't build them, you know. So it's interesting to sort of look at this relationship, no, between the non-state and the state actors. How do we sort of then, if the crime is ecocide and that is a state crime, but also a corporate crime, that non-state actors can be involved in holding states accountable. In this instance, the tribunal, right, or let's say the People's Tribunal as a kind of forum, is one that was first introduced in the 70s as a response to the Vietnam War and set up by a philosopher, Bertrand Russell, and Jean-Paul Sartre in Sweden and in Denmark, as a response, right, to the U.S. actions. Actually, its use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War as a defoliant, first instance of ecocide where the term was coined as an alternative forum, right, to hold states accountable, right? In this case, the United States government. So it is then to support or to produce or you know, forums, right, where you know, international lawyers, you know, and state parties, right? In this case, let's say the Pacific Island states might be, you know, the clients, right? In that sense, it's also interesting when you brought up that term. How do you do a project without a client, or how do you do a project without the money, right? Really tangible, you know, questions. So I think those, to sort of conceive or to sort of facilitate these forums is something that we're in the long term sort of interested in, right? But it is also to work with on specific cases with specific groups of people, right? It has to be specific on almost sort of working as an ecocide crime unit.